What if I told you that your childhood didn't just shape your memories, but silently programmed the way you think, react, love, and survive? Not on purpose, not consciously, but permanently. If you grew up in the 1980s, you were raised inside a world that no longer exists. A world without constant watching, without instant feedback, without digital safety nets. And that single fact changed your psychology forever. Welcome back, 80s kids. This is not a nostalgia trip. This is not about music, fashion, or movies. This is about why people who grew up in the 1980s move through the world differently. Why they stay calm when things fall apart. Why they struggle to explain emotions but handle pressure better than most. Why they feel slightly out of place in a hyper-connected world. This is the psychology of growing up when freedom came first and supervision came second. Pause for a moment and remember this. As a child, you left the house and disappeared. No phone, no tracker, no constant check-ins. You didn't send updates. You didn't ask permission every hour. You simply went. And somehow the world trusted you to come back. That absence of monitoring wasn't accidental. It was the default. Parents didn't hover. They assumed competence before proof. And psychologically, that assumption matters more than we realized. When a child is trusted early, the brain wires itself around autonomy, around decision-making, around internal responsibility. You didn't wait for instructions. You acted first and adjusted later. If you were bored, no one entertained you. You invented something. If you were lost, no one rescued you immediately. You figured it out. If something went wrong, you assessed the situation yourself before involving an adult. This created an internal rule that still lives inside many 80s kids today. I am responsible for handling this. Not someone will fix it. Not someone will tell me what to do. Me. That mindset becomes a psychological anchor. It explains why people who grew up in the 80s often remain functional during chaos, why they don't immediately panic, why they look for solutions before sympathy. They were trained for it without realizing it. Now let's talk about freedom. The 1980s gave children something that feels almost radical today: unstructured time. Hours with no schedule, no adult direction, no optimization, just time. And inside that empty space, the brain learned creativity, negotiation, and self-regulation. Children created their own rules. They enforced their own consequences. They resolved their own conflicts. If you wanted to play, you had to convince others. If you broke a rule, you dealt with the reaction immediately. There were no screens to hide behind. No filters, no escape routes. That constant exposure to real-world feedback trained emotional calibration. You learned when to push, when to pull back, when to apologize, when to stand your ground. Those skills didn't disappear. They matured. Today, many 80s kids read rooms better than algorithms. They sense tension before words are spoken. They understand tone, silence, and body language, because they had to. But independence also came with risk. You fell, you got hurt, you failed publicly, and no one rushed in to soften the experience. In the 1980s, pain wasn't a crisis, it was information. You scraped your knee, you cried, you were told to breathe and keep going. That doesn't mean it was always healthy. But it was formative. It taught the nervous system something critical. Distress is survivable. So when life hits hard later, the body doesn't shut down immediately. It stabilizes first. This is why many people from this generation don't collapse at the first sign of adversity. They may feel deeply, but they respond practically. However, there's a hidden cost here. Because emotions were rarely discussed, many 80s kids grew up without emotional language. Feelings were experienced, not explained. You knew something hurt, but you didn't always know how to name it. That creates adults who are incredibly resilient, but sometimes emotionally quiet. Not because they don't care, but because they were trained to endure, not to narrate. This is why emotional conversations can feel uncomfortable, why vulnerability feels risky, why silence often feels safer than exposure. The nervous system learned early control equals safety, and that pattern carries forward. Now let's talk about supervision. In the 80s, adults weren't absent, they were distant. They existed in the background. That distance created something modern childhood often lacks: trust. You were trusted to fail, trusted to recover, trusted to learn. And when children are trusted, they internalize confidence faster than when they are protected. Confidence didn't come from praise, it came from survival. You didn't need validation every time you succeeded, you just moved on to the next thing. This explains why many 80s kids don't crave constant external approval. They may enjoy it, but they don't depend on it. Their sense of competence was built internally. Now, consider this. The world today is loud, constant feedback, endless opinions. But the 80s were quiet. Silence existed. Boredom existed. And boredom is where imagination grows. When the brain isn't overstimulated, it turns inward. It reflects. It creates. This shaped a generation that is comfortable being alone with their thoughts, and that is rare now. This comfort with silence is often mistaken for emotional distance, but it's not. It's self-containment. People who grew up in the 80s learned early how to regulate themselves without distraction. No scrolling, no dopamine shortcuts, just time and awareness. That skill doesn't fade. It becomes a form of psychological grounding. So when modern life overwhelms others, 80s kids often retreat inward rather than outward. They don't broadcast distress, they process it privately. Again, not always healthy, but deeply ingrained. Now pause and reflect on this. You were raised without a constant audience. Your mistakes weren't recorded. Your awkward moments weren't archived. Your growth happened off camera. That freedom created psychological safety. You were allowed to change without explanation. Today, many people feel trapped by their past versions, but 80s kids evolved quietly. They didn't brand themselves early. They discovered themselves gradually. That's why identity for this generation often feels flexible. They adapt. They shift roles. They reinvent. Not because they are unstable, but because they were never frozen in time by a digital record. This adaptability becomes critical later in life, because when the world changes, those who grew up adapting survive best. And the world changed fast. But before we get there, one more thing matters deeply. The 1980s taught children that the world was not built around them. You waited your turn. You shared resources. You lost sometimes. That reality built psychological humility. Not insecurity, humility. You learned that effort didn't guarantee success, but it increased your odds. That belief fuels perseverance, and perseverance becomes a lifelong advantage. This is why many people who grew up in the 80s keep going when others quit. They don't assume comfort is a right. They assume effort is required. Not because they enjoy struggle, but because struggle feels familiar. And familiarity reduces fear. This is the foundation. Independence, autonomy, resilience, self-regulation. Everything else builds on this. In the next part, we'll go deeper into emotional resilience, failure, pain, and why people who grew up in the 1980s handle pressure differently than almost any other generation. This is where the psychology becomes uncomfortable and revealing. Before we go any further, we need to talk about something most people misunderstand about those who grew up in the 1980s. They assume toughness means lack of emotion. They assume silence means indifference. They assume control means detachment. That assumption is wrong. What actually formed in the 80s was not emotional absence, but emotional containment. And there is a critical difference. People who grew up in the 1980s didn't feel less. They learned to carry more. As children, emotions were not framed as something to be explored, they were something to move through. You didn't sit in long conversations about how something made you feel. You felt it, and then life continued. This trained the nervous system in a very specific way. Stress was not treated as an emergency. It was treated as part of the environment. Falling off a bike wasn't trauma, it was data. You learned how fast you could go, where the risk was, what recovery felt like. And because no one rushed in to label the experience, the brain stored it as survivable. That matters, because when stress is survivable early, it stops triggering panic later. That's why many people who grew up in the 1980s don't escalate emotionally right away. They assess, they stabilize, they wait. This is emotional resilience in its rawest form. But resilience came from repetition. You didn't just experience difficulty once, you experienced it often. Losing games, being excluded, getting hurt, failing publicly. And each time you learned something subtle but powerful. This won't end me. So today, when work pressure rises or relationships strain, the nervous system doesn't immediately collapse. It tightens. Focus sharpens. Action begins. This is why 80s kids are often described as solid during crises. They don't fall apart first. They hold things together. But here's where the trade-off appears. When emotions are consistently pushed through instead of named, expression becomes secondary to control. Many 80s kids grew up believing that showing emotion was a liability. Not because anyone explicitly said it, but because no one rewarded expression. You were rewarded for coping. That creates adults who can tolerate immense pressure, but feel exposed when asked to open up. They don't lack emotion. They lack safety around expression. This is why emotional conversations can feel destabilizing, why vulnerability feels like giving up control, why silence feels safer than explaining something messy. Control became the strategy. And control for an 80s kid equals survival. Now, let's talk about failure. Failure in the 1980s was not softened. You lost. You knew it. Everyone else knew it. There were no consolation prizes, no reframing in the moment. You either adjusted or you stayed behind. And psychologically, this built a healthy relationship with failure. Failure wasn't identity, it was feedback. You learned that losing didn't define you. It informed you. So you tried again. This is why people who grew up in the 80s often take calculated risks as adults. They are not reckless. They are familiar with loss. Failure doesn't feel fatal. It feels instructional. And that familiarity removes fear. Fear only dominates when the outcome feels unknown. But 80s kids know what falling feels like. They know what getting back up requires. and they know it's possible. This becomes incredibly powerful later in life, in careers, in leadership, in entrepreneurship. They don't need guaranteed success to start. They only need a chance to try. Now, pause here for a moment. Think about how often modern life avoids discomfort, how quickly pain is interrupted, how fast distractions appear. The 80s were the opposite. Discomfort lingered. Boredom lingered. Awkwardness lingered. Consequences lingered. And because nothing removed them, children adapted internally. They learned self-soothing without external stimulation. No screens. No endless content. Just awareness. This built an internal emotional regulator. That regulator still exists, which is why many 80s kids don't need constant stimulation. They can sit in silence. They can wait. They can endure monotony. This is often misunderstood as emotional distance, but it's actually emotional endurance. However, endurance without expression creates tension. And many 80s kids carry emotions internally for long periods. They don't explode easily, but when they do, it surprises people. Because the pressure has been building quietly. This pattern shows up in adulthood as delayed emotional processing. They don't react immediately. They process later, sometimes much later. And unless they've consciously learned emotional language as adults, those feelings can remain unspoken. Not unfelt, unspoken. Now, let's talk about authority. The 1980s respected authority, but didn't explain it. Rules existed. Reasons were optional. You followed instructions not because you agreed, but because that was the structure. This trained children to operate within systems without constant validation. They learned to function even when things didn't make sense. This created adults who can work within imperfect systems without becoming paralyzed by frustration. They may criticize privately, but they move forward. However, it also created skepticism. Because authority wasn't transparent, trust wasn't automatic. So many 80s kids grew into adults who question systems quietly. They don't rebel loudly. They adapt strategically. They learn the rules, then decide how much to follow. This creates a very specific psychological posture. Compliant on the surface, independent underneath. Now, here's something important. Resilience does not mean immunity. Many people who grew up in the 80s carry stress without realizing how heavy it has become. Because they learned early not to complain, so they don't notice burnout until it's advanced. They keep functioning. They keep showing up. Until one day, the body speaks louder than the mind. This is why many 80s kids experience delayed burnout or emotional fatigue later in life. They don't collapse early. They collapse suddenly. And recovery requires learning something they were never taught. How to slow down without guilt. How to express without losing control. How to rest without feeling weak. This is not intuitive for them. It must be learned consciously. And those who do learn it become exceptionally balanced, because they combine resilience with awareness, strength with softness. Now, pause here. If this description feels accurate, if you recognize yourself in this pattern, take a moment. And if this resonates, tap the like button. Not out of habit, but because this experience deserves recognition. In the next part, we'll move into something equally important. social skills, communication, friendships without algorithms, and why people who grew up in the 1980s relate to others in ways that feel increasingly rare today. Kids of the 1980s didn't have social media. They didn't have apps that dictated how to interact. They didn't have platforms that filtered relationships into likes, followers, and streaks. They had faces, voices, presence. And presence was everything. You had to be there, physically, mentally, emotionally. No edits, no delete buttons, no chance to hide behind a screen. This trained a skill that's rare today: real-time social calibration. You learned to read micro-expressions. You learned tone, timing, and pacing. You learned when to push, when to pause, and when to step back. These skills were honed through games, conversations, and conflicts. They weren't taught in classrooms. They were learned on the streets, in tree houses, in bedrooms, and at arcades. Think about that for a moment. A disagreement at the arcade. Someone grabs the joystick. Tempers flare. A lesson in negotiation unfolds, without an adult intervening, without a text explaining what went wrong. That was learning social nuance. And that's why many 80s kids today excel in real-world interactions. Meetings, negotiations, team dynamics. They navigate social landscapes with an intuitive skill many younger generations never developed. Friendship in the 1980s was not instant. It required commitment, time, patience. You couldn't unfollow someone if they annoyed you. You couldn't hide behind curated posts. If a friend hurt you, you had to confront it, or lose them. This created deep loyalty, the kind that lasts decades, the kind that forms the foundation for lifelong communities. Yet it also fostered a kind of patience that is increasingly rare. You waited your turn. You shared your toys. You negotiated. You compromised. And compromise wasn't optional. It was necessary. These patterns built adults who value long-term relationships over quick gratification. They value substance over surface, depth over breadth. At the same time, conflict wasn't avoided. It was inevitable. You learned to face it, solve it, or navigate it silently. This builds an internal confidence that many modern social systems cannot replicate. Now, consider how these skills translate to adulthood. People who grew up in the 1980s often read social cues with precision, handle group dynamics intuitively, sense tension before it escalates, know how to negotiate and mediate quietly, because every interaction as a child was practice. Every conversation mattered. Every disagreement carried consequences. And these skills extend beyond friendships. They influence how 80s kids approach leadership, parenting, teamwork, and partnerships. Which brings us to the next point: collaboration. Games, sports, and shared projects were laboratories of teamwork. You didn't just play, you strategized. You negotiated roles. You managed victories and losses together. Every interaction taught lessons about fairness, trust, and accountability. And because these lessons were lived, they were internalized deeply. Now, let's touch on something vital. Conflict in the 1980s often included silence. A friend might ignore you for a day. A sibling might refuse to cooperate. and you had to adapt. No constant digital reassurance, no emojis to soften the tension. You had to navigate discomfort. This is critical, because learning to manage social friction early creates adults who can handle negotiation, leadership, and collaboration without panic. And yet, this social learning came with subtle costs. People who grew up in the 1980s may struggle to express vulnerability immediately. They learned to adapt, not to expose. This is why emotional conversations sometimes feel awkward, because the default mode was internal processing. Now, consider peer pressure. It existed, but it wasn't amplified through networks. It was immediate, local, and personal. You learned to balance individual desire against group norms. You learned social strategy, not social validation. And these skills translate to adulthood in unexpected ways. Many 80s kids become excellent team leaders, mediators, and collaborators. They can navigate office politics with subtlety. They can maintain friendships over decades. They can build communities. And their ability to read people, it's often unconscious. The brain learned social nuance before screens existed. Now, let's integrate this with independence. Social competence combined with autonomy creates a unique psychological profile. Self-reliant, emotionally contained, socially intuitive. This explains why people who grew up in the 1980s often feel different in the digital era. The rules have changed, but their brains were wired for offline navigation. Here's an example. You enter a room of strangers. The conversation starts. You assess body language, tone, expressions. You calibrate your responses before words leave your mouth. And this is entirely intuitive. No conscious effort, no manual, just decades of practice. Now, let's talk about empathy. Real conversations foster deep empathy. When you faced someone's anger or sadness, you experienced it fully. You couldn't ignore it behind a screen. This builds adults who understand not only what others say, but how they feel, which is increasingly rare in a mediated world. And this brings us back to friendships again. 80s kids often maintain long-term friendships because they know the value of persistence, shared experience, and understanding. These bonds are not accidental. They are the outcome of repeated, meaningful interaction over time. Finally, let's prepare for a reflective moment. Think about your own childhood. Who were your friends? How did you resolve conflicts? How did you negotiate, share, or compromise? Those early social lessons are still guiding your behavior. Now, before we move on to relationships and deeper attachment patterns, let's include an action. Think about your 1980s friendships. How did they shape you as an adult? Share your story in the comments. Your experiences will resonate with others. And that is the power of social learning in the 1980s. It shaped not just who we were as kids, but who we became as adults. Relationships in the 1980s were unlike anything most children experience today. They were built slowly, deliberately, and often with real consequences. You didn't friend someone instantly online. You showed up. You spent time. You invested energy. And if you didn't, the connection faded. This taught early lessons in attachment, loyalty, trust. You learned that relationships required effort, that bonds weren't disposable, that collaboration, compromise, and patience weren't optional. They were necessary. Friendships and romantic relationships followed the same pattern. You communicated face to face. You negotiated misunderstandings in real time. You learned to read not only words, but tone, expression, and intention. And when those early lessons are internalized, they shape adult attachment styles. Many 80s kids became adults who value depth over breadth, who prioritize loyalty and long-term bonds, who can collaborate effectively in teams because compromise was learned in childhood, not taught in books. These lessons in loyalty and trust extended into how we lead as adults. Whether in workplaces, communities, or families, 80s kids often assume responsibility for both themselves and others. But there's a subtle nuance. The same independence that made them resilient also taught them self-reliance first, dependence second. So relationships can feel like a balancing act, wanting connection yet valuing autonomy, engaging fully yet protecting inner strength. Now let's look at collaboration. Games, sports, and shared projects in the 80s were microcosms of real-world teamwork. Board games, playground contests, and group projects demanded cooperation, strategic thinking, and conflict resolution. You negotiated rules, mediated disputes, and celebrated victories together. These experiences honed social intelligence, empathy, and leadership skills long before they were recognized as valuable. But relationships also included moments of friction. A friend might ignore you, a sibling might refuse to cooperate, and you learned to navigate discomfort without digital intervention. This builds emotional flexibility, adapting to change, enduring tension, and managing conflict without immediate outside input. Now, consider how this translates to adulthood. People who grew up in the 1980s often excel in team management, conflict resolution, community building, maintaining long-term relationships, because the lessons were lived, not taught. They were internalized through repeated, meaningful practice. And here's where modern viewers can reflect. The digital generation may learn rules of collaboration, but rarely the emotional nuance. Face-to-face experience breeds intuition that no online interaction can replicate. Empathy, timing, patience, and subtle negotiation become second nature. Now let's bridge this to work ethic. The 1980s emphasized effort, responsibility, and process. Work wasn't abstract or symbolic. It had tangible outcomes. Completion mattered. Effort mattered. These lessons carry forward into professional life. Adults who grew up in the 1980s often approach tasks with discipline, initiative, and accountability. Failure doesn't paralyze them, it instructs them. Now, pause here. Before moving to the digital transition, it's time to include an action. Think about your relationships from childhood. How did these early bonds shape your adult friendships, partnerships, or teamwork? Share your experiences below. Your story may help others recognize their own patterns. Continuing, let's discuss adaptation from analog to digital. By the late 80s, technology began creeping into daily life. Computers, early video games, and eventually the internet demanded new cognitive skills. But unlike children born into digital worlds, 80s kids learned to adapt. They merged analog intuition with emerging digital fluency. This hybrid mindset allowed them to bridge generations, understanding both real-world unstructured problem-solving and abstract tech-mediated processes. And this combination is psychologically significant. It fosters adaptability, cognitive flexibility, and comfort navigating change. Those who grew up in the 1980s often thrive in environments requiring both independence and collaboration. To summarize this part, relationships taught patience, loyalty, and social calibration. Friendships and conflicts honed emotional intelligence and negotiation. Collaboration and teamwork became second nature. Work ethic was grounded in tangible effort. Adaptation began bridging analog experience with digital demands. These traits continue to shape adult behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Work ethic in the 1980s was not abstract. It was visible, tangible, and measured in results. Children observed adults working without constant recognition. Chores, homework, part-time jobs, they learned that effort mattered, that discipline and persistence paid off over time. You didn't see shortcuts rewarded. You saw consistency, diligence, and follow-through build tangible outcomes. This shaped adult behavior profoundly. Many people who grew up in the 80s approached tasks with initiative and focus because those lessons were ingrained early. Failure wasn't celebrated. It wasn't hidden. It was examined, learned from, and integrated. This builds resilience and a practical approach to problem solving. You learn to try again, adapt, and improve, not for validation, because that's how life works. Now consider adaptability. The 1980s were primarily analog, but the digital era emerged rapidly. Computers, video games, and early internet systems demanded new skills. 80s kids were the first generation to navigate both worlds. They learned to translate analog experience into digital fluency, to adapt old methods to new environments, to use prior knowledge creatively when facing technological change. This hybrid skill set shaped careers, entrepreneurship, and innovation. People from this era can bridge generations and technologies because their foundational learning encouraged flexibility and self-reliance. Identity in the 1980s was not tied to digital presence. It was cultivated through experience, effort, and observation. You were not constantly measured by peers online. You were free to experiment, fail, and grow without permanent record. This creates adults who can navigate change without anxiety about constant evaluation. However, this freedom also produced challenges. Control and self-reliance were prioritized. Vulnerability was secondary. Emotional processing was often internalized. Many 80s kids grew into adults who carry stress silently, only addressing it when necessary or when it becomes unavoidable. They excel in situations requiring self-management, strategic thinking, and independence. But they may struggle with prolonged, unstructured emotional expression. Now let's integrate this with modern life. 80s kids are uniquely positioned in today's world. They possess strong internal motivation. They maintain focus under pressure. They are adaptable across technological and social transitions. They value effort and integrity over appearance and instant gratification. Yet their relationship with stress and emotion can be complex. Because early experiences rewarded control and resilience, they may undervalue rest, recovery, or open emotional sharing. This duality defines their adult psychology: strength and resilience, capacity for deep empathy, self-reliance balanced with selective social connection. Now pause for reflection. Consider your personal work ethic and adaptability. Think about how your childhood shaped your approach to challenges, technology, and social engagement. The world changed fast, but 80s kids adapted, and that adaptation continues to define their success and approach to life today. We've seen independence, resilience, social skills, relationships, and work ethic. Next, we will explore how 80s kids handle change in a rapidly digitalized world, their sense of timing and belonging, and how they feel out of sync in modern life. The world changed rapidly after the 1980s. Digital technology transformed how people communicate, work, and socialize. Those born in the 1980s were uniquely positioned. They grew up analog, but adapted to the digital revolution. This transition was not seamless for everyone. adjusting from a world of direct interaction and unstructured play to one dominated by screens, instant messaging, and constant connectivity required cognitive flexibility. And yet, many 80s kids managed this transition with remarkable ease. Why? Because their childhood taught them to adapt, to learn through trial and error, to self-regulate, to solve problems independently. These foundational skills enabled them to bridge generations, technologies, and social norms. They could navigate both offline and online worlds effectively, interpreting digital nuances without losing their analog intuition. But even with this adaptability, many 80s kids feel out of time in today's world. The pace is faster, expectations are higher, and distractions are constant. A generation raised on patience, presence, and deliberate interaction can feel unanchored in a culture built on immediacy and perpetual notification. Yet this sense of disconnection also offers perspective. It allows 80s kids to prioritize depth over speed, relationships over algorithms, and effort over instant gratification. It is a quiet strength that balances the chaos of modern life. Now, let's reflect on the emotional and psychological culmination of these experiences. The independence, resilience, social skills, work ethic, and adaptability cultivated in childhood continue to shape adult identity. They influence relationships, professional success, problem-solving, and leadership. They create individuals capable of endurance, empathy, and strategic thinking. And yet, the lessons of the 1980s are not only about personal advantage, they are about perspective, understanding human behavior, appreciating the subtle ways in which formative experiences shape personality, habits, and choices. Here's the final action for our viewers. If you want to explore more insights into generational psychology, personal growth, and the hidden forces shaping behavior, hit the subscribe button now. Join us as we continue to unpack the fascinating intersections of history, culture, and human development. Finally, remember this. We've been riding this thing called life without training wheels since 1980. We fell, we got up, we learned, we adapted, and we continue to move forward. Carry that perspective with you. Honor the lessons. Share the story.